Welcome to the Foster Friendly Podcast, where we come together to make a difference in the lives of children in foster care and the families who care for them. Foster Friendly communities are part of a nationwide movement by America's Kids Belong that helps people from all walks of life take action and help kids and families thrive. You'll hear from former foster youth, foster and adoptive parents, social workers, faith and business leaders, and other experts on how to engage in meaningful ways. Our hosts Brian, Travis, and Courtney explore inspiring stories of everyday people making a difference in foster care where they live and work.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Foster Friendly Podcast. Joined today by my co-host Courtney. We're going to be talking about the topic of sleep, how relevant and needed and elusive that thing can be. So before we get into introducing our guests and more of the topic, Courtney, how many hours of sleep do you need? What helps get you to sleep? Just what is it?
Yeah, I'm pretty good about sleep. I get about 8 hours a night. But I'm kind of different than a lot of people. I fall asleep or I go to sleep reading pretty much every night. And I feel like it's probably for me because I have a large family. It's kind of my way to just forget about all that stuff. And then I start reading a novel and then my mind will be in that. And then I can fall asleep and not be like worrying about my kids or what do we need to do tomorrow. It's just kind of my way to relax and forget.
Hey,
So how about you, Travis? How do you?
my wife and I often watch YouTube videos and just travel kind of stuff. So my deal is waking up. I fall asleep. It's just the wake up stuff. So can't wait to hear more about maybe some help on that today.
Yeah. Good deal. Well, today we are joined by Allison Ezell, sorry. I'll start that over. Yeah.
There we
I
go.
told myself like 10 times, ease out. Today we are joined by Allison Ezell, who's going to help us build a bridge between holistic sleep habits and our children's trauma. So herself, like after she struggled for years with her adopted son's sleep issues, she began to realize that there's like huge hole in foster and adoption space, and nobody out there was really educating on how to support our kids and through their trauma and how that relates to their sleep. So she decided to do something about it. So we're going to hear about that today, and we are just so thankful that you are here joining us, Allison. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a huge honor. I am a huge fan of you guys. So super thrilled and grateful to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we dive into the sleep stuff, tell us a little bit more about your family. How did you get into foster care and adoption, and what was that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So my husband and I, adoption came up early on when we were dating, to be honest. I have a grandmother who was adopted from foster care back in the 1920s. Super different, not at all what it is, 100 years later. She actually lived in an orphanage. It was kind of an Annie Miss Hannigan situation, and was adopted by the orphanage director. And so I kind of grew up knowing her story, was always really touched by it, always thought adoption would be part of um my story, my family one day, and then happened to marry a man whose father was adopted at birth privately as an infant. And so we kind of came into marriage thinking that would be part of the way we grew our family one day. And then we ended up having two biological kids very quickly in our marriage and sort of thought, okay, that's good. We're done. Well, maybe not. And a couple years later, we just really felt this draw towards international adoption, actually. And so in 2016, we adopted our third child internationally. He was born in China, came home at about 14 months. And then again, we were like, we're good, we're done, check the box, we did the thing. And then we very quickly realized, okay, hold on, maybe there's more here. A couple years went by, and then COVID happened, and in the pandemic, we sort of just felt this burden somehow to get involved with vulnerable kids right here in our own backyard. And we sort of thought we may adopt again one day from China. And then the pandemic really shut that down. And if you've seen any of the news lately, that's actually ended completely, unfortunately for the kids there. But we thought, okay, we don't need to go across the world. We can serve vulnerable kids right here in our own backyard. And so we actually got certified as foster parents during the pandemic, which looked very different, I think, than typical licensing. But we got certified as foster only parents during the pandemic. And our now adopted son came to us in May of 2021. So we have 4 kids, two now adopted and 2 biological.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Love
And the
hearing this
connection with
story.
your grandma, like that's so,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd love to not, we don't have time today, but someday I'd love to just dive into that and even like the differences between back then. If you know a lot about that, it's fascinating to really research and know the history of foster care in the United States.
Yeah. It was always very fascinating to me, and she loved to tell stories. She loved to talk about it, and she actually had 2 brothers. She was adopted with 1 brother, and then the other brother was separated and adopted on the other side of the country.
Oh,
So we've always had a big heart for siblings and things like that. Didn't end up getting placed with siblings, but hearing her story about being separated and how they came back together and things like that, her story was wild.
wow.
So
Yeah.
really, really interesting to grow up with that
Yeah.
as a kid and to hear about all that. It gives you a real heart for those kids, for sure.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing us in a little bit to your story and kind of where you guys have come as a family. It's super cool. So, as we pivot into the discussion today on sleep, you got certified as a pediatric sleep consultant. There's a title in 2021 while fostering your youngest son and founded Dwell Pediatric Sleep in early 2022. Tell us more about that journey, how all that came about.
Yeah, so Dwell really came about because of my son Brooks. He is our son who was born in China. And when he came home, sleep was just a mess. And we were absolutely unprepared. We were completely unprepared for that to be the case. The only advice we've been given at all during our pre surface training was that sometimes kids from trauma have trouble sleeping, co sleep. And that was literally the only thing we were told the entire pre service training. And so our pediatrician, of course, in his very non trauma informed wisdom, recommended a sticker chart, which did absolutely nothing for him. And, so I had this toddler who was waking up frequently all night long, hysterical, grieving, which if you've ever had a kid nighttime grieve, it is a very gutter, it is a thing you don't forget. It is very sad, and it is something that sticks with you. And so we sought out some therapy for him and, also went the medical route of getting him into a neurologist to get some sleep medicine, direction as well. And what I really found was that these 2 professionals' advice were in conflict with one another. And so, the TBR therapist was recommending certain things, and the sleep medicine doctor was recommending sleep training. And I just thought, how do I do this? How do I make the right hand and the left hand talk to each other? How do I bridge that? So I went on a quest to find somebody who could help me do that. And there are tons of sleep consultants out there, but none of them are taking that trauma informed approach. They're just pushing sleep training, and they're just pushing cry it out and these types of things. And I knew that wasn't right for him. I knew that was not going to be our path. And so I was venting to my husband one day, and I was like, listen, I've spent the last 3 years trying to make sense of these things, and I can't figure it out. There's got to
Mm.
be something that I'm missing. I need more sleep knowledge. I have a master's in education. I get kids, like I understand child development. I have a ton of trauma training, but I don't understand sleep. So I want to help people. I'm going to go get certified as a pediatric sleep consultant and see if I can kind of use my background and my experience and my knowledge to kind of make sense of sleep. And he went, "Go for it." He said, "I think that's fantastic. Go for it." He was all about it. He, was like, "I think
Mm.
you'd be fantastic at that. It uses your teaching background and, obviously something you're very passionate about." Um and we did it with a foster toddler at home, which I still am like, "You were nuts." Um, you could manage that because he had been with us about a month when I applied, for my certification, and, so we were just in the first 30 days of a foster placement are bananas, and so I was like, "Sure, why not go back?" So that's not crazy. And so I did. So I got certified and began Dwell Pediatric Sleep about 3 years ago, in the beginning of 2022, and it has been wild. It was so clearly a need, so clearly a hole, and it's just been such a crazy, last couple of years to just watch this thing just take off
Hmm.
fire.
Very cool.
Very, yeah. As a foster adoptive mom, I see that exactly what you said. Like I train foster parents, and then I'm a mentor to foster parents, and I get phone calls all the time about sleep and food. Right? I think that's two things.
Yep.
There's other things, but those are like two common all the time. People just have questions about them. So why is sleep such a hard thing with our children who come to our homes through hard situations, through trauma, through foster care, adoption? Why is it so hard?
I think for a couple of things. I think number one, we have to remember that trauma impacts the brain and sleep is neurological. So
Mhm.
of course it's coming from a place of hard. I think you also have to look at the context of sleep. At least in the Western kind of expectation that we have of sleep, we typically want kids to sleep alone in the dark for a long period of time, separated from the most important person that they have. So,
Hmm.
when you think about it in those terms of, for a lot of kids who have experienced really dark, really hard, really scary
Mhm.
things alone in the dark at night, trigger, 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 right?
Hmm.
And so when you think about it as more than just physiology, right? Because sleep at its core is a biological function. We have to do it to survive. But when you think about the complexities of it, when you think about a kid who has been neglected overnight, when you think about a kid who has been through abandonment, who has been through hard things when they were alone, who has been through scary things in the dark when they were separated from their
Mhm.
caregivers. Of course it's hard. Like, of
Hmm.
course it's hard because in our minds, this is the way we sleep, right? We put sleep in this little box of it has to be this, this, and this. And even with foster care standards, it has to be this way. And yet, that it for so many of our kids from hard places, it's just triggers everywhere. So when you really strip it down, they don't feel safe. And I
Mhm.
think you also have to remember that sleep is it's a very vulnerable thing to completely and totally surrender control to the people around you, to trust that they're not going to harm you, to trust because it is a vulnerable loss of
Yep.
control. And for kids who
Mhm.
have already been through a complete and total loss of control, a complete surrender, things have been out of their control. It's just triggers everywhere.
Yeah, it's our son, which I'll ask you more about a little bit later, but he came to us at 2 through foster care, and immediately we're like, there's sleep issues going on, right? So it had been probably close to a year before they said, okay, well, we need to do a sleep study, right? We're in foster care still, so it was very dictated by what they said we could do. We do the sleep study, and he was sleeping. I'm not joking, like up maybe 2 hours a night between
Wow.
like how much he was getting up, and it was affecting everything else throughout the day. So we do the sleep study. My husband goes to the sleep study with him, is sitting right next to him, and he sleeps perfectly. And so then we say,
Huh.
"Okay, he's 2, can we not" almost 3 at this time, "Can we please, like, bring his bed?" And they would not let us.
Yeah.
And I think back, I'm like, that right there, like, it is what you're talking about. Like, obviously, there was a disconnect between having somebody right next to him, not in the same bed, but just next to him, versus being by himself and how much it affected him at night. And it's like, "Oh, poor buddy," you know?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so hard.
Oh
And
man.
so much of it is just that lack of confidence, right? So many kids who are they're just terrified. They feel completely anxious, insecure, they have no confidence in separation at all. They are those stage 5 clingers who literally you have a magnet between you and they just follow your every move all day. And so when you think about
Mm.
sleep in the context of it being separation, it can be really hard for high anxiety kids.
Well, admit it's one of those things where, as you point out, in that situation, the three sort of just blatant triggers. It's man, like light bulbs come on and wake us up. But I was thinking too, like, also the vulnerability and the backstory of so many of the kids that may have been abused at night, removals you'll hear about. Like, I think in the case of I've many kids, talk about the cops coming at night, right?
All of the night.
And so like, right. And so like all of that's stored too. Like, we talk about trauma being stored in the body. I mean, like, yeah, gosh, it's just so I think I was lamenting as I was kind of, thinking about this podcast coming up about, um the innocence of childhood to me so much, if you've maybe come from a really stable home and maybe there weren't like health struggles that could cause it, but just how I felt like childhood and sleep kind of to me in an innocent way go hand in hand. Like later the world and stress and even relationships and dating and high school, all of that starts to come. But to be so young and on top of all you've been through, the trauma to not even be spared to be able to sleep as a 5-year-old, or it's just it's so sad.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's awful, and it's so incredibly common, and so many of the things, especially as foster parents, that we want to do that feel like the right thing, right? Like laying with kids until they fall asleep, or when they have a nightmare. I still remember thunderstorms. I literally would crawl right up between my parents. It was my little safe zone. I would crawl up between my parents in bed, and I would be like, okay, I'd have my little like cocoon, and I was like, okay, I'm safe here because I was terrified of thunderstorms. But so much of that, and I understand the safety aspects of it. I understand why licensing is the way it is, but it's so hard when you can't even respond in the ways that you want.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, on a practical note of starting to kind of apply some of your knowledge and all that you've learned through this, like, you kind of reference sleep holistically and things like that. So, kind of what does that mean practically for listeners, trying ways to help their children more? And then are there tips and tools that sort of for all ages, or how do you kind of unpack some of the practical on sleep?
Yeah. I look at sleep as a very holistic thing. Yes, it is scientific. Yes, there is a science to it. Yes, it's physiological. And, from that point of view, there are things like understanding sleep pressure, right? Sleep pressure is a child's drive to sleep. So, if you think about, these kids that take these marathon naps in the middle of the day, and then their parents are frustrated because it takes them 2 hours to fall asleep at night, right? That's a science issue, right? That's a sleep pressure issue. There's not enough sleep pressure for bedtime, right? So that is kind of in my opinion, whenever I'm working with a family, that's the low hanging fruit, right? That's the easy things to manipulate. That's just looking at kind of like the core, right? So looking at things like the sleep environment, schedules, timing, that's kind of the low hanging fruit, right? But really in the case of foster and adoptive families, sometimes you don't even want to get there until you deal with the deeper stuff, until you deal with, okay, does this child even feel safe walking into their sleep space? Because for a lot of kids, when the bed, and I noticed this with my own son, just saying the words, it's time to get ready for bed, and moving towards his room, his whole demeanor changed. And he was this happy-go-lucky kid all day long, and then it was something about night, and it was like Jekyll and Hyde, and a
Mhm.
different version of him showed up at night. And I hear this all the time from parents that this is a very common struggle. The night version of their kid and the day version of their kid are two completely different things. And so I think when I say I look at sleep as a holistic thing, yes, we want to address the science. Yes, we want to make sure that we're getting the timing right. Yes, we want to make sure we're looking at things like sleep associations, right? So what are the conditions your child's falling asleep in? And are those things changing later, right? How can we work on sleep associations? How can we work on sleep pressure? That's the easy stuff, right? But what we also want to think through from looking at the child as a whole child, right? Where's their confidence? Where's their
Mhm.
confidence in separation? Where's their confidence in their sleep space? What's in their toolbox, right? Because when kids have tools, when we equip them with tools, when they are given strategies, when they know better, they do better, right? Kids want to do well, but but if they don't have any tools in their toolbox, they don't have anything to go on. So how can
Mhm.
we equip them with tools? What do they need? Do they need an auditory focal point? That would be like an audiobook. Do they need, kind of like you said, Courtney, you said you read to sleep to kind of tune out the day. A lot of kids need that. I love these new audio players that have come out for kids, these Tony's boxes and these Yodo players. I think those are so helpful for kids that just need to turn their brains off, right? They need to just listen
Mhm.
to a very monotone voice
Mhm.
read a story to them, and so that they can tune out, right? How can we help their bodies, right? Some kids are just, if you can just get them flat, That's the trick. How do we get them
Mhm.
flat? Because once they're flat, they're out.
Mhm.
If they are, they're either 0 or 100. There's no in between, right? So, what tools does our child need? How can we help them learn to regulate and calm? And that's a dance for a while, right? We know that's a co-regulation dance for a while, but eventually they need to have these tools in their toolbox. My daughter, my biological daughter, is actually super high anxiety, and she has a whole toolbox. Literally, it's a caboodle next to her bed that is her sleep
Caboodle.
toolbox. When she is struggling, it's a caboodle because she's 11. But of
Yeah.
course it is. But she has in there things that she knows will work for her. So she has journals, she has fidgets, she has gratitude, like affirmation, gratitude journal and affirmations, and she has things to pull from. So when I say it's holistic, it is literally brain and body. So let's address the science with the brain. Let's look at the body. Let's look at the emotional. Let's look at the confidence. It's so many different things. And rarely do I sit down with a family where it's just one thing.
Hmm.
Rarely do I sit down and say, oh, well, it's all a timing issue. You just got to fix the timing. We
Hmm.
also need to look at the emotional, the confidence, all of those types, the emotional, the mental, all of those things in order to get, the picture moving in the right direction.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So going back to my son, I was telling you about, so he is now 7. He's been with us for 5 years, and for 5 years, it's been this struggle of sleep, and we've tried, again, he was still in foster care for a couple of the years he's been with us, but, we've seen specialists and sleep doctors and did the sleep study and melatonin and medicine and nothing. We finally figured out how to get him to sleep, right? We tried all these things. We got him to go to sleep, but then it was like an hour later, he'd be up and up every 20 to 30 minutes all
Staying
night
asleep.
long.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So again, like it's been multiple doctors, and finally, I feel like kind of like what you were experiencing. Different doctors are or different specialists will contradict each other. And from day one, I've been saying there is trauma. This is trauma related, and some of them look at me like I'm absolutely crazy when I bring that up. Like, okay, it's not trauma. This is sleep. I'm like, no, but it's trauma.
Yeah.
And so we've been trying on our own we've been doing our own research of like what are the things that we feel like are tied to this? And he also has an eating disorder. And so we thought with this eating disorder and this sleep and getting up a lot of times thinking about in our mind, thinking about food and when's food coming. Um, we've tried different things, but one thing that we found, the only thing we found to help so far is cutting out sugar from his diet. And I'm just so curious if you have any insight as to why would that be something that's helped him fall asleep? And how does food play a role in sleep? And are they interrelated, or is that just me playing doctor?
No, no, they
Uh-huh.
absolutely are. No, they absolutely are. Nutrition plays a huge role in sleep, and in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, food insecurity, which it sounds like has been a has been a struggle. Food insecurity and that constant need for more. And for a lot of kids, it's not even that they necessarily have to be eating all the time; they just want to hold it or they just want to see it, right? Sometimes I'll have parents put, depending on the age of the kid, just leave a little snack on their nightstand. They just need to know that it's there. They don't have to eat it, right? They just need to know that it's there. But a lot of times, nutritional deficiencies can play a big role in sleep. B12 is a huge nutritional deficiency that's out there a lot, and it actually controls circadian rhythms. So it can cause a lot of frequent wake ups. Iron is a huge nutrition issue. A lot of kids that have specifically iron stores issues have a lot of frequent waking, a lot of restlessness, a lot of jerking. And then, blood sugar stabilization happening overnight. I'm a huge advocate of bedtime snacks, especially for kids with food insecurity. And specifically not talking about just like, hey, here's a cookie, go to bed, but specific being very intentional. It sounds like you guys have been with getting that to be a high fat, high protein type snack, like a cheese and crackers or like a peanut butter or, a smoothie or a sandwich or something that is going to stabilize blood sugar overnight. Because when blood sugar dips overnight and get nightmares. You're prone to more parasomnias. It can cause
Hmm.
more frequent waking. And so there's a huge link between the two in terms of deficiencies, insecurity, and blood sugar stabilization too. They absolutely go hand in hand.
Hmm.
It's all fascinating.
Yeah. I geek out
Well,
about this stuff.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking myself too. I'm like, I've had a lot of nightmares this last year. My sugar dipping throughout and I feel like I'm eating a bedtime snack. Hmm.
Yeah, well, and then we all, of course, chocolate. Chocolate, of course, is everyone
Yeah.
eating, which, but in so many
Right.
American households, it's just typical you get dessert after dinner, and nobody really
Yeah.
thinks twice about it.
Right.
But if there's that big high sugar content right before you try to sleep, it can definitely create a lot of this. And it's,
Yeah.
because when kids wake up in the middle of the night, right? If you're anything like me, you kind of go through that mental checklist. Are they hungry? Are they scared? Was it a nightmare? Are they cold? Didn't the wind blew weird? Right? You kind of go through that checklist, right? And so a lot of times, if we add a bedtime snack to somebody's bedtime routine, it's kind of like one less thing we can take off the list, right? Because we know we stabilized blood sugar, we know we met nutritional needs proactively, right? And so it's kind of one less overnight variable.
Hmm. Oh, that makes sense.
One thing that I just want to tie back to again, the whole connection, because actually it was just National Nap Day yesterday or the day before, and at America's Kids Belong, we posted a little social media thing on it, and something that I wrote of thinking about their senses, like could you add, an essential oil? Could you add a weighted blanket, or like all the different senses, which is great, and I think they're great starting points. But if our kids are missing the connection and aren't feeling secure in their connection, again, going back to our son, who I feel like from the very beginning, if we could have had him in our room and just been in his presence, how much a difference that probably would make today. We just had a teenager in our house a couple weeks ago. She was only here for 10 days, but she was with us for about 5 days. We sit down, we have a little meeting, and she's like, I am not sleeping at all. I am having nightmares, like really bad nightmares every night. But she was used to sleeping in a hotel room with 10 other people. And so I kind of looked at her and I was like, do you think it would help if you were in a room with my other two teenage daughters instead of downstairs by yourself? And she's like, I think that'd make a huge difference
Yeah.
because I'm used to being with people.
Yeah.
And you're like, why didn't I think about that immediately when she got to her home? Like, would you like to sleep here or here? Giving her that choice, we automatically think, oh, they're teenagers. They want to be by themselves. But it's like, that's not, we have boys that we adopted from Ethiopia. They've never wanted to be in their rooms by themselves too. I mean, to this day, they're adults and they
Hmm.
still
Mhm.
want
Yeah.
somebody in the room with them.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you speak more to the connection part of it? Like what we could do maybe as parents to help that aspect? Because it's probably what we see a lot in the foster care and adoption world.
Yeah. I think room sharing is one of the most powerful things we can do, honestly. And that was a game changer for my own son. And now I know there's logistics and rules, and you have to play a little bit of Tetris sometimes when you get a placement to figure out where they're allowed to be and all those types of things. But that was a big game changer for my own son because when we were in China, we visited the the orphanage essentially that he was in, and he was in a room where there were cribs lining around the outside, and then there was like a horseshoe in the middle, and he was one of the kids in a horseshoe. And so he was used to being in a room with 20, 25 kids all the time, every minute of every day. And without getting too much into his story, being alone was a major trigger for him. And so one of the biggest game changers that, again, I got scrappy to just figure out my own kid, like a lot of his moms do. But I got real scrappy trying to figure out how to help him. And so one of the things that I had read, I think it was Karen Purvis actually, who recommended laying out a sleeping bag. I remember she called it a bedroll. And I had to be like, what's a bedroll? A sleeping bag is what I would call it. But rolling out a sleeping bag at the end of our room, right? At the end of our bed that he yeah. So, in terms of connection, I think room sharing is such a valuable tool for a lot of our kids. A lot of our kids have come from co sleeping situations. A lot of our kids have group settings, things like that. My own son was in an orphanage setting and he was in a room of 20 babies all the time. He was never alone. And without diving too much into his history, being alone was a major trigger for him. And so one of the things I actually saw from Karen Purvis is that she recommended rolling out a sleeping bag, next to a parent's bed on the floor, and allowing the child to come there when they needed to. And so we did that for a long time, and it was his deal. And I actually use this strategy a lot of times with parents. It was his deal. It was part of our bedtime routine. He would get his sleeping bag out from underneath our bed. He would roll it out next to where I sleep. He'd have an extra pillow. He actually had an extra lovey he would put there. And then we'd go to bed, and he knew it was there when he needed it. I kid you not, he came to it twice. He came to it 2 times. but he knew it was there. We continued this for almost a year and he knew it was there. And just sort of like almost having that snack sometimes nearby. A lot of times kids just want to know there's a backup. They want to know that something is available to them if they need
Hmm.
it. They don't always need it, but they want to know that it's there. It's that felt safety piece for them of knowing, like, if I feel afraid, I know what to do. And it's practicing that with them, right? And so it's building that confidence, it's
Mm.
separation of knowing there's a backup plan for me. Um, and so what we eventually did is we moved that sleeping bag. Thankfully, my oldest has always been very easy with sleep and accommodating his siblings. And so I was like, "Hey, bud, this was he was about probably how old was he at the time? Probably 8." And I went and I said to him, like, "Hey, Brooks has been using the sleeping bag in our room for a long time. Would you mind if we laid it out in your room tonight? Because number one, he's a little bit afraid to come downstairs because it's dark. You're just right across the hall from him, and he feels safe with you. So if he needs it, could he come sleep on the floor?" Well, we went through that routine for 4 years. And he would go in there some, I think because it was closer
Mm.
and just because he liked having a sleepover with his brother. But I think so much of that was just that connection piece and really getting his, acknowledging that being alone and being separated was really hard and working as much as we could to sort of build his confidence with that. But then in the interim, right, meeting him where he's at and giving him kind of a backup plan for what to do when he is really just feeling like, "Hey, me being alone tonight is it's just a bridge too far today." And that was something his
Yeah.
therapist actually said to me that was incredibly powerful in one of our early sessions with her. Was she said, "Allison, I think you just need to grieve the idea that you had in your head for how this was going to look, because you decorated this room for him. You had
Mm.
all these visions of coming in to see your sleeping little cherub in his crib, and I think you need to grieve the fact that this isn't going to look the way you thought it would, but
Mhm.
this can still be good. It's just you need to let go of the vision that you had of this peacefully sleeping, calm, baby being in your home that you dreamed of for all these years. That's a bridge too far for him. We're asking more of him than he's capable of at this point. So let's work on meeting him where he's at and really working on connecting with him so that he feels and builds confidence and felt safety in those moments of separation."
Makes total sense. Yeah.
And that is such a great point to hammer home. Just also, in your context, sleep, but generally what you just said there about foster care itself and about sort of like that idea to you might have had an expectation about whatever that was, what family should look around the table at a meal, at what, devices or what, all that kind of stuff, the routines that you're kind of speaking to in this context, sleep, but generally that we do need to adjust and to adapt to where they're at and kind of meet them. Maybe we change our family routines or whatever, but
Yeah.
yeah, I really love that
Yeah.
even generally too. So kind of getting to the home straight away here. And nap day, you said it was yesterday, so I can't use that excuse today. If asking my wife if today I can have a nap, but okay, so we know summer's around the corner, and that's where routines change, and often for good or bad or whatever. But it's different. It's a different sort of rhythm. Can you help us, Allison, of just um what about routines and especially the summer where what tips on that or where we shouldn't maybe
Yeah.
switch on
I
things or
think this is kid
what do you say to the
dependent.
summer?
I think you have to kind of know your kid and know. I have one kid that can be loosey goosey, doesn't care, doesn't need the like structure, and they're fine. They can roll with it. And I have other kids, two of my four, who having no structure, having no routine is their worst version of themselves. And I think you
Mm.
have to really look at your kid and say, okay, does my kid, because really, I mean, structure is a huge pillar of felt safety. So I think for a kid who really needs predictability, who needs consistency, who needs structure, and not everybody, and not every kid does. This is very much their temperament too. Temperament plays a huge role in sleep. And I think for them, it is worth sort of the sacrifice of keeping some level of routine. Now, when it gets to be May, you're going to see all over Instagram our summer daily routine and all those kinds of things. Listen, I've got 4 kids. That doesn't fly in my house. But if it does for you, that's fantastic. That doesn't really work at my house. But I do like to keep, generally speaking, for my kids that need it, kind of a set, morning wake time. We kind of go through our little morning routine, and the same with bedtime. And so I think for some kids that's going to be important. One thing, my kids are 5 through 13. So even at their ages, we do take what I call FOB time every single day of the summer. And it's FOB, which stands for flat on back. Not one of my kids naps anymore, but there's a lot of them. And so we need to go to separate corners sometimes. So that is one thing that every
Mhm.
single day, unless they're like out at a camp all day or something, that is something that we have built into our routine. And so it is literally, you go to your room, you go to your room. So they got to go to their separate corners because there's a lot of fighting. 3 of my kids are boys. So there's a It's a lot of
Imagine that.
WWE at my house. And so we just need to separate. So I think when it comes to summer, I think understanding your kid, and if you get to a point where you just said, like, I just want to roll with it, like, I just want to be flexible and free, well, that's great. But if 2 weeks in, you're like pulling your hair out, maybe you need to get back into something like that.
Mm.
So I think it's kind of kid dependent, temperament dependent. But not if you are going to let go of the structure of time in the summer, I think it's important to not abandon structure altogether, because that will, especially for kids from inconsistency in their backgrounds, kids that have had a lot of caregivers, things like that, that can be a really difficult thing for them, because predictability and consistency is such an integral piece of their felt safety. So I think for certain kids, you got to kind of watch
Mm.
that. And the easiest thing to do is just to have a set morning wake time, which you don't want to do in the summer because you're like, I want to sleep in, and I get it, but it can domino into the whole rest of the day, and
Mhm.
that's kind of that low hanging
Yep.
fruit, right? That's the easiest piece of the day to manipulate, to kind of get things started off on the right foot, and to help the dominoes fall a little bit better the rest of the day.
It is
Mm.
great.
It's really
Yeah.
helpful.
And
Yeah.
help those on even to the summer months, because we all know, like I said, it's hard with a lot of kids too. But I
Yep.
love how you said that, like really looking at them as individuals and what do they each need and how can we make this work together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it can be
Okay.
tricky
Well,
to do
Ellison.
that when you have multiple, because you sort of just want everyone to kind of follow the same routine. But I think, you know, it can be it can be good, and you can have good intent there, but not every kid's going to respond the same way.
Yeah. And fair is not equal. That's
True.
what a common thing we say in our household.
Same,
Mantra.
same.
Yeah.
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 There's a
Well, as we close this out, one thing we like to ask people. So could you please finish this sentence? Ellison, what do kids in foster care really need?
A cheerleader. I'm going to say a cheerleader. I think a lot of times when I'm working with families, I really like to take the approach of like being on the same team with your kid. And I think a lot of times, especially around sleep, we get into power struggles. We get into power struggles like, this is the way you're going to do it because this is the way I say. And, we get into a lot of power struggles with kids who won't stay in their bed and that come out of the room a million times. And they want you to do this thing and you don't want to do this thing. And so there's so much tug of war. There's so much tug of war. And I think a lot of times, especially with kids where sleep is really tricky for them, it can feel like we're on opposite teams. And a lot of times, the biggest step we can take is just to realign and say, hey, I'm your cheerleader. We're going to be on the same team. I'm going to guide you.
Mm.
I'm going to support you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to coach you, but I'm not going to be against you. And that can be a really powerful mindset shift when it comes to sleep. Because when you're tired, listen, when you're tired, you just want some sleep, right? You just are like, I will do anything. I remember at one point looking at my son and be like, I will get you an emotional support turtle if it means you will just sleep longer than 2 hours at a time. Like, I'm so
So
tired.
I
Like,
can sleep.
he's crying, I'm crying. We're just crying on the floor together. And, I think really being like, why are we fighting about this so much? And then really being like, hold on, you're on the same team. You're on the same team. And to really shift that mindset to, I want to grow with you. I want to support you and encourage you. I want to be your cheerleader as you grow and as you move through life, can be a really powerful mindset shift. And I think every kid in foster care needs at least one cheerleader in their life.
Oh, true.
Well said.
Okay, well, if somebody's listening is like, hey, this is great, but I'm struggling. I need more support than an episode of a podcast. How can they reach out? How can they find you to get better training, more training in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the vast majority of what I do is working one-to-one with families. That is my favorite thing to do. That is where the magic can happen because we can really dive into, because I can talk holistically about sleep all day, but what really is the magic is when we really get into your specific child with their specific history, which makes a big deal. With their specific history, with their specific struggles, with their specific routines. So that's my favorite thing to do is walk with a family one-to-one, whether that's just one meeting or whether that's for, a period of time together. That's my favorite thing. Dwellpediatricsleep.com is my website, which has all the different one-to-one options there. I also have an online course specifically for foster and adoptive families that is, in my opinion, what was missing from all of these pre-service trainings that we didn't get, where it walks through sleep science, what I call sleep science 101, and then it walks through how trauma impacts sleep. And it's the bridge. It's the bridge that nobody could give me. And so I've created it for other people. So it is an online course on my website as well. There's newborn info there as well. And then Instagram. Instagram is my favorite place to hang out. I have a Facebook as well. I don't hang out there quite as much, but Instagram is my favorite place to hang out. I am Dwell Pediatric Sleep there as well. And I had a TikTok until all the weird stuff happened, and now I don't have one anymore. But
And I love following you.
I don't have a TikTok.
I love following you on Instagram. You have you just post such practical things all the time and little tips that's like, I just need that reminder and that reminder and that one. So I highly suggest following you.
That's my happy place. I do weekly question and answer sessions there. And I'm not a gatekeeper of information. I literally just pour out what I know as much as I can and just try to help as many people as I can, whether it's there or in the more, paid opportunities. That's not what I'm here for. I'm just here to help. So as much as I possibly can.
That's amazing and so needed. And we, on behalf of the country and foster parents everywhere, hired parents in general, thank you so much for all your work and care and
for the work that you guys do for foster kids and your advocacy and your education. And I am grateful for you guys as well.
Yes. Have a good day. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, will you help us reach more people by subscribing, sharing the podcast with a friend, and leaving a 5-star review? If you've been inspired by what you've heard today and want to learn more of how you can make a difference for kids in foster care and the foster families where you live, visit americaskidsbelong.org. We depend on individual donors to fund our work. We'd be grateful if you would consider joining us as a monthly donor. Visit americaskidsbelong.org to make your tax-deductible donation. Thank you. Together, we can ensure a family for every child in foster care and a foster-friendly community to ensure every foster family feels loved and supported.